Hey everyone, it's about time that I started talking about step components on the OPXY. There's a lot to cover here and a lot of applications. You can just look at my OPZ videos if you don't believe me, but I'm going to keep it simple and only talk about adding drums and using some of my favorite step components on drums. So this is going to cover a lot, but believe it or not, there's more to come. So what I have right now is just a bass line and a very basic melody, and then I made these first three tracks all the boop drum kit. So here's what I have right now. There's some parameter locks going on, some LFOs, some sends to the effects, but nothing too fancy. Maybe just a ramp up or two. Even though OPXY defaults to having drums only on tracks 1 and 2, I have put the boop kit on tracks 1, 2, and 3 because I like to have my hi-hats on track 3, my snares on track 2, and my kicks on track 1. So that way I can mute them separately, I can apply the filter separately, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stick with that for these examples. I'm going to move to the snare track, and I'm going to add a snare, and then I'm going to start talking about bringing up the step component menu, or how to edit them. So I'm going to find a snare, and I'm going to put it on steps 5 and 13, so that it hits on beats 2 and 4, because we have track scale at 1. I can add or remove step components by holding Shift and then selecting the steps that I want. When you hold Shift, it's going to dim any step that doesn't have a step component on it. So even though there's no trigger here, let me just add a step component there. It doesn't matter what. Now when I hit Shift, I can actually see this is a little bit more brightly lit. This might be harder to see if your LED brightness is low or if you're in a really bright environment, but I find it pretty helpful. To remove a step component from this step, I'm going to hit that again, and then it's going to highlight any key that actually has a step component here. So I could have like 5 of them, right? And then when I go back to this step, I will see all 5 of these lit up. Each of these has its own individual value. So what I mean by that is that these behave a bit differently depending on the value associated with them. So I'm going to hold down multiply, and I can see here the value is 2. If I hold down, if I hold down velocity, I see the value is 5. If I hold down ramp up, I see the value is 4. Ramp down, values 4. Random, values 4. So I can deselect all of those, or I can edit them, or anything like that. I can do that with multiple steps at once, but I cannot deselect yet. So on OPZ, you can deselect a step and it will stop flashing if you tap it again. You can't do that on XY right now. We'll see if that changes. The very first step component I want to cover is called skip trigger. And so I'm going to add another. And so I'm going to add a different snare sound here. I'm going to put it on this very last, this 16th step. I want this occasionally, but I don't want it every time. Like if I want that every second time, I could just copy the bar over and remove it, or I could use step components, which is what I prefer. So I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to tap this step here. Now, something really important. I'm going to hit this very last key, this second E on the keyboard. And that is our first step component we're going to go over. It's called skip trigger. I might sometimes call it a trigger spark because that's what it was called on OPZ. But I'm going to add this to this step. And before I do that, I really want to emphasize that it's going to bring up some text on the screen and the name will be correct, but I would ignore the rest of the words. So let me hit this. So by default, it's going to give me this value 2 right here. It's correct that this is a skip trigger step component. But this description here, skip every second trig, is inaccurate. Because what it's actually going to do is it's going to skip the first trig, and then it's going to play the second trig, which is flashing. Hitting the same value multiple times will cause different numbers to flash, which will indicate which steps do and don't play. And so for everything 3 through 9, you have 4 options you can cycle through, which are, in this case, for instance, just the 4th time, just the first of every 4 times, the first 3 out of every 4 times it'll play the step, or it'll play not the first time, but the next 3 times. So let's just, like I said, keep it at 2. It's that simple. So I'm going to play it, and it's only going to play this every second pass. Let's also make it so that the snare doesn't come in, this first snare doesn't come in until for the first pass. So I will add a trigger spark 8, 8, 8, and then 8. So it's going to play, it's going to skip this on the first one, but it will play on the next 7. So I will also mention that I don't know what 1 does. I have no clue what skip trigger 1 could possibly do, because that should just make it play every time, right? I don't know. There might be something else weird that I'm missing with it. I don't know. It was the same thing on OPZ, though. You also have 0 as a value, and 0 is going to randomly play this trigger, but it works a little differently than I first expected. So 0 is going to randomly play any combination of the notes on this step. So if I have a, let's just do a few different sounds we'll be able to hear distinctly. So I'll do a kick, a snare, a hi-hat, and that cowbell sound. If I put a trigger spark 0 on here, it might just play the cowbell. It might play none of the notes. It might play all of them. And so that's what this random does. And it will show you which notes it's currently playing. And you can see that it's not consistently, yeah, it's just doing a couple at a time mostly. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that step now. And let's talk about the other 2 skip components, because they work very similarly, but they do slightly different things. We started off here on this second E, which is the furthest to the right step component. But instead of going to the one immediately to the left, I'm going to skip over that and go to this C right here. These 3 skip components, one works on triggers, which means it'll mute whatever notes, or it'll play whatever notes on certain passes based off of this step component. This is a skip component, which affects all these other step components, just not the other skips. And this is a parameter one. And so that's what I want to move on to next, is this skip parameter. And what this is going to do is it's going to skip the parameter locks that I apply to a step and only apply them on those passes that are flashing here. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to pull up the mixer. And then on this step, I'm going to add a parameter lock by holding the step down and adjusting this, which is going to be the FX1 send. So that's sending to delay. But I don't want that to happen every time. In order to make sure it doesn't happen every time, I'm going to hold shift and I'm going to select that step. Then I'm going to add this skip parameter. And I'm going to make it only do this every 4th time. So it's not going to send this to FX1 the first 3 times, but on the 4th time, we'll hear that delay being added to it. This next time. We could use this exact same concept to actually fade out the snare on the 8th time. So let's just mess with that. The way I'll do that is I'm going to open up the mixer again, and I'm going to add a parameter lock here, move the 4th encoder, that's volume, and it's going to be what it's currently at. And down here, I'm going to add a parameter lock and turn volume all the way down. By default, this is just going to make it so that this one step is muted. But I'm going to open up the bar menu, and I'm going to adjust this 4th encoder, which controls shape. And so now we'll see the volume gradually fading out. But I don't need that to happen every single time, right? You'll also notice it's ignoring that parameter because I have it on the skip parameter. So that's another interesting behavior you're going to have to figure out how to use strategically or how to avoid if you view it as like a bug. It's not a bug, but I see why it would be annoying. Okay, so I added a parameter lock 4 to every single step here, and it's going to make it so that that fade out happens only every fourth pass. So this first time normal, second time normal, and here we go. So if you wanted to fade out a track, you could do it that way. I'm going to remove those parameters though, because we're going to do some other stuff with them later. I will add the parameter lock back here. We're not hearing it in the preview because it is already applying that parameter spark. Okay, so I just removed all the step components I had before. I still have this every second time on the 16th step, and I've still got this skip parameter 4 with a send to fx1 on step 13. And as you might be able to imagine, this also gives us another way to mute. If we're not going to use trigger spark, I can also mute, like what if I want to mute 1 and 8? I can't just do that with a skip trigger. But I could do that with a combination of skip trigger and either skip parameter or skip component. If I do that with skip parameter, what I'm going to do is I'll add a skip parameter 8. So it's only going to apply this parameter lock every 8th time. And what's it going to do every 8th time? Well, it's going to mute this track. So I'm still on the mixer, holding that step down, moving the 4th encoder all the way down. So it's going to mute the step on the 1st and 8th pass between these two step components. If you want to use this for muting, you're going to have to change shape by turning it off from bar. And here we'll be able to see it behaving a little more normally than it was before. And so what if I wanted to do that play 2 through 7, but not 1 or 8, but without using the parameter spark? Well, I can use skip component. And this works exactly the same as the other two. I add this step component, and then the flashing numbers for the value are going to tell me when it applies. And it's going to control when it applies any of these remaining, how many would that be? 11 step components right here. And so if I want, I can use this as another way of muting. I'm going to use skip component, and I'm going to put a skip component 8. So it's only going to apply what I do next on the 8th pass. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a velocity, and velocity 9 is worth memorizing because velocity 9 will mute. So what I'm doing is I'm effectively adding another mute by making it play this note with a velocity 0 every 8th time. And it's going to skip the trigger the first of every 8. So we have that same pattern, but now we're accomplishing it with two different skip components. But that's not the only one I like to apply velocity to. So I really like using velocity on my hi-hat tracks or for shakers and things like that. And let's just find a sound. Let's just use this. And what I might do here, let's just add 8 steps. You could add 1 for all of these. I generally like to just do maybe half at a time. So I held down bar and I made it so there's only 8 steps. First, I'm going to do a little bit of editing here. I'm going to make it so that this is a shorter clip. I'm going to make it higher pitched. Then I'm going to add a high pass filter. And let's just pan this a little. And so this sounds fine, but what if I just want to emphasize certain notes? Like it would be pretty common for me to want to emphasize the step here and the step here. What I can do is I can hold shift and I'm going to select all the steps except for those steps. So I'm going to select steps 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 8. And to all of these, I'm going to add a velocity. But I'm going to make it 3. I don't remember exactly where the midpoint is, but velocity 3 is going to make these all pretty quiet compared to the others. And if it's not as quiet as I want, I'll just change it to velocity 2. Let me make it more exaggerated. I can hear that fine, but I'm not sure if it's super clear. Yeah, now it sounds like a bit more of an emphasis on those beats, right? So that's one way of using velocity. I like it that way, personally. You could, of course, add this on the snare. So on this hit right here, I want it to be a little bit quieter. So let's just make it a slower slower velocity. I'm going to copy this step and do it. And actually, to make this even more exaggerated, I'm going to add a multiply to this step. So I'm going to hold shift, select that step. Now I'm going to add, well, it's divide or multiply. There we go. So it says divide into 2 trigs. That just means it's going to play 2 trigs in the span of this step. And so it's going to give it kind of a roll feeling when we hear it. So here we go. Maybe I only want that to happen every 4th time. And I could do the same thing here. So what I might do is, because I know that this is when the snare is going to be hitting, I might make this one have that little roll. So I just held shift, selected step 4, and added a multiply 2. But I only want this to happen every 2nd time, because we're only using this at half of its length. So I only want this to happen before the 4th beat instead of before the 2nd. So let's listen to what this sounds like now. Maybe we want this to happen every 4th time. We want it to do that on the 1st one as well. And we could even exaggerate the groove here on the hi-hat track. So I'm pulled up the metronome page. I'm going to change the swing a bit. Actually, I'm not even going to change the swing. I'll make it only affect this track. So it's neutral right here, but I'm going to pull up bar. I'll hit shift and hit bar so that it freezes it there. And I'm going to move this 3rd encoder, which is groove. And let's also do the same thing with the bass. Let's add some groove to it too. And maybe also here. I guess I could have just applied it universally, but I don't want them all to be the same number. Next, I want to talk about tonality, which is this one right here, which looks like a fan for reasons that I do not understand. I would love it if somebody could explain to me where that comes from. But what I want to talk about here is on the drum tracks, I find it really helpful to use tonality 6 and 7. I'll cover all the tonality values eventually, and especially when we get to the melodic tracks, but right now I'm only going to be using 6 because it makes it go up a semitone, and 7 because it makes that note go down. If I hold shift and select this 3rd step, I can add a tonality 6, which is going to be chromatic up. And what that means is that on this step, instead of playing this note, it'll play that note. Or I could have it play down one. Let's do that instead. Let's have it play down a note, chromatic down. So to edit that, I held shift, hit that step, held down tonality for a second so it doesn't just remove it, and now I'm going to change it to 7. So I will have this happen the first of every 2 times. And because the hi-hat and the open hi-hats are pretty close to each other, I find that really helpful. But let's say that you didn't like the sound one semitone up or down from this step. Well, I can select that same step, and I'm going to just do, let's just do chromatic up just to make my point here, because I didn't like that sound. I didn't think it fit what I was going for. this one right here. So what I'll do is I can hold shift, open up the sampler menu, and I'm just going to go down and find an open hi-hat sound that I do like. There we go. So I found the one that I like, and now it's on this step. And because I placed it right here, and this is the note that's playing, it's going to play this note instead whenever that step component is applied. Let's have it do it every second time, because that seems just better. I'll also make it a little bit quieter, just because that open hi-hat's a bit louder. I could edit the sound, of course, in this kit, but I don't feel like that right now. The last step component I'm going to cover today is jump, and I'm only going to really just talk about a few of the values, and mostly because I think it's a pretty neat way to split up a track. So on this hi-hat track, I of course have these first 8 steps only, but I can make this play a lot more, and I can add some structure if I use these other steps and I use some of the jump step components. I'm going to have it repeat this first part 4 times, and then I'm going to have it repeat this second part 4 times. And for the second part, let's just make it something that sounds different. Or maybe I'll have this do 6 and 2. That seems like a good option too. Oof, I just changed tracks on accident. So I'm going to go back to track 3, add this note there, make sure it's the same. Yep. I'm going to hold shift, and now I'm going to add my step components. So I'm going to add a jump 1, which is going to take you to the first step on this page. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to have it repeat. I'm going to hit 6, 6, and then 6, because I want it to repeat this. It's going to go back to the beginning 5 times, meaning that it's going to play 6 times in a row before it comes here, which I want it to play twice. But I can't just have it jump back to 1. I'm going to hit jump 3, which is going to jump to step 9 on this page. And I'm going to have it do that not the second time. I'm going to hit 2 again, the first of every 2 passes. So this is what we have. It's kind of like a fill, but not exactly. We'll do something similar for the kick and the snare tracks in a second here. Okay, so let's add in a kick track here. So I'm going to add in my kick, and I'll just have this pretty simple. This time I'm going to make it 2 bars long. So I'm going to hold down bar, and I'm going to hold shift and hit plus. So that's going to copy this first bar to that second bar. And I'm going to go ahead and make it so it repeats this first bar 3 times, and then it's going to go to that second bar every 4th time. So I will go to the 16th step, hold shift, select it, add a jump 1, add a skip component 4, or no. I want it to play 4 times before moving on, so I'm actually going to do 3, 3, and 3. Because I want it to play once, repeat once, repeat again, and then play the next page for the 4th one, for the 4th pass, the 4th measure, I guess, sorry. So let's just change this up a little bit, and let's just make it so that these are all in kind of weird spots. Well, not weird spots, but, you know. is a really weird behavior that you should know about that is a bug that I'm going to pester them until they do fix. But right now, if you have multiple patterns playing in a row, they will really mess with your step components counting. So let's say that I have on this pattern here, let's say that I want to play this snare the first of every 4 times on this step, right? But I want it to start doing that as soon as it moves to this pattern. I'm actually going to run into a lot of trouble trying to get that to happen. So I've sequenced patterns 3 and 4 to play one after the other, and I have muted these 4 tracks, so I believe this should only last 1 bar before it moves to pattern 4. And instead of playing that snare on the first time, it's going to skip it because it's still counting the passes from this pattern as part of that next pattern. Let me show you what I mean. And so it didn't play that, right? But it will play it this time because it's the 4th time. So that's what I mean. It's doing, or the 5th time, I mean. So that's what it's doing, some real weird stuff where it is counting even though these are literally different patterns. Entirely different patterns that it's playing here. I really wanted to emphasize this because it's pretty infuriating right now and can really throw things off. Okay, so I hope that you learned something from this. I'm always a little bit torn on how to introduce these because I've used them enough that I sometimes forget what's confusing at first. So please let me know if you have any questions. Next time, I'll focus more on melodic tracks and a lot of the step components I haven't used yet, and then we'll talk about using them on aux tracks, which is something I've been really learning to do and really enjoying a lot lately. Before I get going, I wanted to plug my Patreon account because this is how this topic was officially chosen. Last time I put a poll, 1 vote went for the topic I chose, but another vote went for this topic, so I just decided to use it. If you want to have a say in that, please join my Patreon. And if you're interested in one-on-one video lessons, please comment, or you can email me, or you can hit me up on Patreon and we'll figure that out. But please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.